Today's tutorial is this Underbust JSK, and dresses are one of the most requested things, and I will be making JSKs with a bodice instead of just an underbust, but because I bought this fabric about 8 months ago in fall, this is wool, I wanted to make a winter dress, but now it's spring, almost summer, and I still hadn't done it. I thought I'll do it now so that I can get some use out of this before the full heat hits. So this is my first JSK tutorial, and for this project you will need your fabric. I had 1 meter by 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, and I ended up with some extra, this big piece and some smaller scraps that I will show you how to make accessories from in a later tutorial. But take in consideration that if you don't want just a plain skirt, if you want to add ruffles, that will automatically take a lot more fabric, so take that in consideration. And you will also need bone if you want to put bones in yours. Mine has 2 right here, and you will need the decorations of your choice. I had this kind of lace that I sewed on top of my skirt, and this kind of lace that is on the bottom of my skirt. So the fabric was around 20 euros and laces were combined 17 euros. Zipper was about 2 euros, and I had my boning and my elastic, which you will need for your shirring, and I had my pattern paper. This is a bit messy now, but if you don't have any pattern paper you can also use newspaper, but be very careful, especially if your fabric is quite pale in color, because the ink can rub into your fabric and that will leave stains which are not nice. So either pattern paper or some kind of other paper that you can use to make the pattern from. As for what measurements you will need, I have provided mine, and you can use those to kind of see what measurements I used where. And you won't need your bust for this dress because this is again an underbust JSK. So what you will need is your underbust, and that is where you want your dress to begin. It can either start right under your boobs, like mine does, or you can leave a few centimeters gap if you want to. That's all up to you, but you will need that measurement, and you will need the length of your underbust piece. You will need that, and your waist, and you want to measure that from where you want the waist to be. So if you want it to be a bit higher than your natural waistline, you want to take the measurement a bit higher. So take it where you want the dress to end. And after those you want to wear a shirt like this that has visible side seams and something that is quite snug on you, because next you will need to decide how wide you want the underbust piece to be and mark that on your shirt, and then measure from the side seam to the beginning of the waist piece or the underbust piece, because you will also need this. And I recommend that you leave about 3 centimeters from the waist. You will see in the pattern picture in just a minute. You want to leave this curve bit here so that it really hugs your chest. That will look better instead of having this go straight under and then starting the underbust piece from there. You will also need your shoulder width. So measure it from your shoulder to shoulder and have a friend help you with the back measurements. And you will again need to measure how wide you want the back panels to be from the side seam of your shirt to where you want it to be. And you want to make these the same size on both sides. And then that will leave you how wide you want the shirring piece to be. As for the armhole, you want to again take the top seam of your shirt and then follow it all the way to the side seam, and then you have your measurement, and they will be slightly curved. I will show you in the pattern in a moment. So you want the front and the back. And these are a bit difficult to measure on your own, so have a friend help you if you can. And the other measurements that I forgot to mention and you will need is from your shoulder to your underbust and how long you want that to be. That will define how long this piece is before it starts curving to under your chest. And you will also need your shoulder to the waist seam, and that should be pretty much the same than from your shoulder to your underbust plus your underbust piece. So those should be quite similar. If there is a big difference, then you probably have measured something wrong. And if you are very unsure about the bodice and you have some awesome expensive fabric that you don't want to mess up, you may want to use some sort of old sheets or some very cheap fabric that you got off for sale for no money at all, and do a mock-up so that you will know if the size is pretty much right and if you have to add something or modify something or something like that, something. But that will help you make the bodice of your actual fabric a lot easier if you're very new to patterns. So that is something to consider. If you have any questions regarding on how to make the pattern, you can of course ask me and I will try to help. And if you have a bit more like how wide should, for example, this piece be or something like that, if you give me your required measurements, it's easier for me to help you, but I will help you if I can, so please don't hesitate if you have any questions. And this is what the pattern looks like. I'll have this as a photo in the description as well. And it looks a bit scary, but it's not actually. I have a lot of these red lines, which are only to help. You don't have to draw those at all. And the blue lines are the actual lines that you will need. This will be your pattern line. And here are my measurements so that you can compare yourself to mine and use these as a guideline as to what I have done here. And for example, the most important thing is that this is the underbust piece. This will be on your tummy. This will be next to this one. This is the front side piece. These will be sewn together, the front and back side pieces, and this is what comes to the middle of your back. So the ones that you sew together have to be the same, so that these ones under your chest and the side seams under your armpit and the straps that you are going to sew together, those have to be the same. And this is the bone tunnel. This you can leave out if you don't want to use bones. And You want it to be so that you can fit your bone into it. So you want it to be about 2 times as wide as your bone. So mine is 1 centimeter. I have this very flimsy bone that I'll be using. And you want to make sure that what you have for your waist, that it will add up from the bottom measurements, from these, and mine is 1 centimeter bigger because I want this to fit quite snugly, and I have the shirring part to cover me. And depending on your body shape, this can look very different. My underbust is bigger than my waist, so this goes like this, and I have 4.7 centimeter difference. But if you have a very narrow rib cage and a wider waist, it can be to this way, or it can be quite similar. So this completely depends on your body type. And again, the red lines are just to help you understand what kind of measurements I have used. And as for the back, if you don't want to use any shirring, then you will need this only. But if you do want to add shirring, add pretty much half of this. So mine is 17 centimeters in my waist and 22 up top. So I added 10 centimeters. And you want to add the same amount to the bottom and top so that this angle stays the same. And you want to make the back piece slightly shorter than the side back. So this will be the strap, so that you don't get this all the way up to your neck, but slightly lower. And you can play with this. It can be just a few centimeters like I have, or you can make it even smaller, closer to the length of your underbust piece. So you can play quite much with the back piece. And as for the underbust, it's gonna be pretty much a rectangle, again depending on the shape of your body, but mine is a rectangle. And you want this to be pretty much the same length all the way. The difference, 3 and 3 on both ends. And you want to make the curve to this piece so that you can just sew this on. And if you want, you can leave the curvy bit out so that you continue straight here and add this to the underbust piece. But then you won't have this soft curve. Instead, it will have a strict 90-degree angle. So this is again what you want to do. And for the armpit, you want the front side to be a bit more curvy than the back side. But this you can play with a little, and if it doesn't fit, you can always alter it after you've done the bodice. When you're pinning your pattern pieces to the fabric, the most important thing is to place them according to grain of your fabric, so that every piece you lay down is the same way from the waist. So you have to place them like this. You can't put them like this or like this, because when you wash the dress, it will go wonky, because it will stretch differently depending on which way you cut your fabric. So you want to be really careful to place them in the same direction. And if your fabric has big patterns, you also want to line them up with that. For example, if it has some kinds of stripes, you want to make sure that you place the stripe to the bottom of every pattern piece, like you would place them in the same place of the pattern, so that if you have stripes, that they won't go from here, and then in this pattern piece they'll be in here, and then again here and here. So you want to be careful with that. But since my fabric is, well, I can't say printless, but it is so dark and small that I don't really pay attention to the print on this one. And after you've laid down your pieces, if you want, you can draw the seam allowance depending on how big you want it to be. But I'm not gonna draw it, I'm just gonna cut it a centimeter away from the pattern piece so that I have enough seam allowance. And as you can see, the fabric isn't that prone to fraying because it's actually wool. But if yours is, after you've cut the pieces, you want to hem them with a zigzag or an overlocker. But since mine isn't, I'm gonna skip that part. But next you want to cut all your pieces out. For the side pieces that I will need 2 of each, I'm gonna fold the fabric so that I get 2 pieces at once when I cut it. And when you fold, make sure that it is again straight. If you have a pattern, follow it. If you don't, measure from the top and the bottom of the fold that it is even. And place your piece down again, watching from the waist seam that it goes by the fabric. And when you're placing it, try to avoid leaving too big spaces, so you won't end up with 2 big scrap pieces. You want to minimize those. So when taking the seam allowance in consideration, you want to place it so that you leave as little scraps as possible, because that is just wasting fabric. Although if you end up with big scrap pieces, those can be used for making accessories. I will actually make different kind of accessory videos you can make from your scrap fabric, so that you can have accessories that match the skirt or dress you have made. But not today. Today we're going to focus on the dress. Like so. Now you have 2 mirror pieces of the front side piece, and then you repeat it with the back side piece. After I cut all my bodice pieces out, I made the side that I cut them from straight again, and that left me with 116 centimeters by 150. So 116 is pretty good, because when I'm making the skirt, I'm gonna be pleating it, so that means I will need 3 times my waist, which is 73 centimeters. So when I put 2 of these together, that is pretty much the exact length that I need, with a bit extra, which is always good, so I can kind of move around where the zipper will be. So now I'm gonna cut two pieces that are 63 centimeters, and when I sew those together from one side, that will be my skirt piece. Okay, so I was left with about this much extra that I got from the bottom, and I have 1 and 2 skirt pieces that I am going to sew together from one side, and then I'm gonna start pleating. After you've sewn your skirt panels together, it's time to gather the waistband with the style of your choosing. I'm gonna be using pleats, but because I use pleats, I can't put shirring to the waistband, so I only have shirring in the back panel. But if you want to have shirring on the waistband as well, you need to leave one place without shirring that will be pretty much the same width as your back panel. So you want to sew it to the rubber band on the bottom of this. So you want to place it on your skirt to the same place where you're going to put your back panel. So it might be best if you do your bottom first and then the skirt part, but I'm gonna start from the skirt. And because I'm using pleats, it's a bit easier because my fabric has pattern. These kind of, I don't know, is it houndstooth? These kind of boxy thingies. So I'm gonna be making my pleats 6 boxes wide. So I'm gonna count 6, mark it with a pin, and count the next 6, and fold it under. And because I have this pattern, it's also easy to check if it's going straight or not. And I'm gonna pin that down a bit higher. And you want to leave room for a stitch, because we're gonna put a stitch up here so that it will hold all of the pleats. So you want to leave a bit of room. And then count the next. Fold it over, and again make sure that it's going straight. And pin it. And this is what our folds will look like. And I have a bit more detailed tutorial on my how to make a pleated skirt. I'll link that in the description as well. But I'm gonna continue doing these pleats to the whole width of the skirt and then sew them down. So this is another 6. I'll mark it, count the next part, and fold it. And this is why you need the skirt part to be 3 times your waist, because the fabric goes 3 times. After you're done with your pleating, this is what your skirt will look like. I added extra pins to make sure that these don't fold like this when I'm sewing. Hop, one is loose. And I'm gonna sew 1 stitch about here and leave the pins in, and sew another stitch closer to the top so that I really get to keep all of my pleats. And you don't want to back up from the beginning or in the end, because you may have to take these pleats apart, because I have a bit extra, so I don't know where the zipper will be. So I'm not gonna back up, and just using a straight stitch And all the time make sure that your pleats are going the way you want, so you don't have to take them apart and sew again. And next I'll put another stitch right on top, or a bit higher than the first one. So I'm gonna sew it over here, a bit in between the top and the first stitch. Next I'm gonna go and start making the bodice. And if you don't put any shirring on your back piece, you can ignore this step, but I am gonna make shirring. So after you have your piece, back piece, which has the allowance for shirring, you want to cut your elastics, and you want them to be pretty much the same width as the back piece will be after it's sheared. So you want kind of this long, and I am gonna make 7 elastics, and you want the top one to be a tunnel, so I'm gonna sew here and put the elastic through it so that it doesn't show when you're wearing it, because if you just sew it on and put the dress on, you can see it from the top. So the first one will be a tunnel, and if your fabric doesn't have any kind of stripes that you can follow, you want to draw the lines, because after you've sewn your first bit of elastic on, it's gonna make it really hard to see where the next one will be if you haven't drawn on any lines. And depending on what kind of look you want from about 4 to 7 of elastic pieces, also depending on how long the back is. Mine is almost all the way to my neck, so I will have 7, but if you have a shorter one you will need less, or if you don't want to, you don't have to put as many as I will. But because my fabric is heavy, it's wool, I want to put many of these so that it will help achieve the look that I want. So the first thing you want to do is sew a tunnel that will be wider than your elastic so that you can put the elastic through. And after that you want to start sewing the elastics on, but I'm gonna do the tunnel first. And make sure that you have enough room for your elastic, and then just use a short straight stitch, and remember to back up in the beginning and in the end. And I'm not going to put the elastic through quite yet, I'm gonna leave that last. And so next you want to take one piece of your elastic, and I have marked the rows of the square thingies that I'm going to follow. So I'll put this along the first line and I'm going to sew it on. You want to really go back and forth with this one, and with quite a long stitch. And after that, follow the same line all the way to the end, grab it, and then pull. And you're going to sew along the same line all the way. And you want to pull your fabric as you're going, so that you don't break your needle. I'm gonna adjust it slightly. And remember to keep pulling. And I'm gonna back up a lot at the end as well. And that is the first elastic sewn on. And that is how much it will give me extra room. And now you want to sew all of the other elastics in as well. And when you're sewing the next ones on, be careful not to sew this ruffled part next to it. It is a bit difficult, or more difficult now than it was on the first elastic, but just make sure that you don't sew over this bit. And this is what the back panel now looks like. And it has a nice amount of shirring to it. And next, before you put this one in, you want to make sure that when you put it flatly on the table and ignore what the seam allowance will be, that you have enough. Yes, it has now 19 centimeters and I need it to be 17 in the bottom and 22 on the top, so with the shirring it will be the perfect size. So what we're gonna do now is we're going to put the top elastic to the tunnel The next thing you want to do once your back panel is ready is to take your back side pieces and make sure that they're facing in the same direction so that the pretty side is up, and then you're going to sew these together. And you want to start from the bottom because you want all the bottom seams to be on the same level, because this is the waist and we're going to sew the skirt part to it, so it is important that these line up prettily. So you're just going to sew these two together. I'm gonna leave a bit more of the back panel showing because it takes a while for the shirring to begin, so I'm gonna leave it like that. And so, and remember to back up. And then sew the other side on. So this is what it looks like. And now when we have the seam allowance, once we get to that point, we are going to fold it like this and sew the seam allowance to the inside. But we're going to leave it for now. And instead we're going to sew the other side to the back panel as well. And again I'm going to leave a bit more of the back panel showing than the back side panel, because the shirring again doesn't start from the very edge. And try to make them have the same amount of seam allowance so that they match up. So that when you're wearing it, they will be the same width. And we're going to leave these seams unhandled for now, so that if we have to take these in or let them out, it's going to be easier. But once we have done the bodice, we are going to cut down these and make them look prettier, but for now they can stay. And next up, you're going to sew the front side panel, but now you have to decide which side you have your zipper on. I'm gonna have it on the right side, so that side is now on the left, so I am going to sew these together. This is the downside as well as this one, so I am going to sew these two together. If you want, you can pin these, but I don't have the patience for it, so I'm just gonna go ahead and sew this seam. So that now it looks like this. And the next thing to do is to sew your underbust panel on, and we have the bone tunnels, so we have to take that in consideration. But if you don't want to put the bone tunnels in, you don't have to fold it as much as I will. so that when I sew these two together, I want to have the panel this much over, so that when I'm going to sew the bone tunnel I can fold it and put the bone in. So now I'm going to sew this seam. And then it looks like this. And before I sew the tunnel, I'm going to sew the other front panel in as well. And I'll have it come over the same length, so that I have the same amount of space to both tunnels. Okay, so next, this is, let's move that out of the way. This is now the front of the dress. So what you want to do now is make the tunnels. So you'll fold them over the underbust and make 2 seams here, so that you will make a tunnel for your bone. Like so. Now it has the tunnel. Do the same thing to the other side. And you want to check that the bone goes in, but we won't cut or put this in just yet. Next up, you want to sew in or close your straps, shoulder straps. So you're going to pair them up and sew them together, so that it's easier to try this on for size. I'm making small backups all along the way because this seam will have a lot of stress on it. So I really want it to be a strong seam. And then do the same thing to the other strap. And after that, it is all complete, open only from one side, and that is where the zipper will come, and we will fold these later. Next, you want to sew in your zipper, and I'm first going to sew it on like this, and then I'm going to fold it and make another stitch, because there will be quite a lot of stress to this stitch here, to the zipper, so I'm gonna make 2 stitches, just in case. So first I'm gonna sew it on like this, and just leave a little bit of room, because we are going to fold this underarm part. So you don't want to put it quite up top, you want to leave a small amount, about a centimeter, and then just sew it on. And remember to back up in the beginning so that you really get it nice and firmly there. But I won't back up at the end because we are going to have to take it back a little when we sew the skirt part on. And now that I've sewn it on like this, I am going to fold it and sew again so that the fabric goes near to the zipper but not over it, because that will make it harder to open and close the zipper. But I'm gonna make a second stitch right next to it. And again, remember to back up. Try to make the stitch as straight as you can so that it looks neat. And don't back up at the end. And this is what it looks like. It has 2 stitches right next to each other, and then you're going to repeat it to the other side. And there you have your zipper. And again, I'm going to fold the very ends when I am cleaning all the edges. But now you want to try this on for size. Okay, so now you check to see if it fits well. It's okay if it doesn't quite go under your boobs just yet, because we are going to make a fold, so that doesn't matter. Make sure that the back shirring is in the center, and don't mind this, we are going to sew this onto the skirt. And just make sure that you don't have any extra fabric going like this and stuff like that, and if you have to make adjustments, do them now. And next, we are not going to make these pretty by folding them. Next thing to do is to take your skirt part and find the middle seam if you have it in 2 parts like I have, and place it on to the side seam of your bodice. And just make it go around you. If you made it from 1 piece or from multiple pieces, you don't have to mind that, but I'm just gonna do it so that the seam will be in the middle instead of being like in here or here. And as you can see, I ended up with a bit extra. So next I'm gonna mark it with pins so that I can sew it on to the zipper. That one goes there. Oh no. There. And now that you have this floppy part, what we are gonna do next is sew on from the zipper all the way to the edge of your back shirring and back up, make a stop there, and then start from this zipper seam and go away all the way there. And after that we are going to fit this floppy part to the existing part of the skirt that we haven't yet sewn on. And that is why my waist won't be shirred, but if you made your skirt ruffle, then you have one place where you didn't ruffle it, and you're going to match it with this part, and you want to put one more elastic to this edge so that they are both on the same elastic, and that way they both will give the same amount of shirring. And that's how you do it if you want to have shirring on your waist as well. But I'm gonna start to sew these on. I know that the last bit was a bit confusing, so let me rephrase that. If you don't have a shirring to your waist piece as well, you want to pin it first to this small part. This is my zipper seam, and then all the way to this part, and so that way you will have extra of this, and you want to pin it to this piece and make sure that you ruffle it evenly so that I have these tiny ruffles. It's a bit crooked, but that's good. And that way you can sew the whole piece together. And if you do have shirring to your waist as well, so you have ruffled it or gathered it, you want to fully ruffle the whole piece to be the same length as your waist, and you want to first again pin it to this side and pin it over here and even sew it so that it holds. And then you have this piece, which is ruffled and sewn on. You want to take that apart and take one piece of elastic and sew this and this into the elastic. Make sure that the elastic is inside your dress. And that way you will have an elastic on the waistband as well, and that way you will have the same amount of ruffle on this piece as well as here, because if you just leave a random piece unruffled on the waistband and then try to sew it on, it can be really uneven. So you first want to ruffle the whole piece as itself and then sew it so that it stays, and then sew it on to the unshirred parts, then take apart the gathering that you have on this piece and then sew both of these to the elastic. I hope that was some sort of information. Please ask if something is still unclear. Okay, so now I have pinned it all the way, and this is my back shirring. I made little folds to it, and this is the other side, and again a zipper. So I'm just gonna sew all the way around with a short straight stitch. And when you're sewing your bone tunnels, my first one is here, you want to back up a few times so that it's really strong, so the bone won't poke through. And this is the other tunnel, so I'm going to back up, back and forth again to really make sure that the tunnel is strong. And when you're sewing your back shirring, if you have a lot of extra, you want to make sure that you ruffle it evenly when you're sewing it on. I don't have, I left more room for my shoulders and rib cage, so my waist doesn't have that much extra, but if you do have a lot more, you want to make sure that you ruffle it evenly. I made 3 little folds to my back ruffle. And remember to... And before we make the second stitch, you want to try this on to make sure that it is the right size. If it does fit, the next thing we're going to do is finish up the zipper. So you want to see where it will go and align it accordingly. Open the zipper up as much as you can, that will make it easier. And then you want to sew it on again, first like this, and then we're going to make top stitch like this. But first, and again, if you want, you can pin it, but I'm not going to, because I'm lazy like that. So here we go. And then you want to make the top stitch. So you want to start on top of the stitch you already made. And try to manage the bulk of fabric that you will have. It's a bit annoying, but and you want to back up in the middle seam because it has a lot of fabric and you don't want it to break. It's better to have 2 centimeters of not so clean than to have it break. Check to see where your zipper seam ends. And back up. And then do it again to the other side. Check that you're going to sew the same amount. And top stitch. After you've sewn your zipper, you want to flip it over. Flip it over. And make sure that it works. That you haven't sewn in too close to the zipper. And then you realize that you ran out of the lower thread, so you're gonna redo that. And this is what the zipper now looks like. And now you want to make sure that the stitches end at the same place. And the next thing, my zipper is a bit too big. I am going to cut off this excess in a minute, but the next thing you want to do is close the skirt after where the zipper ends. So you want to see, here you have your seams, so you want to leave about 1 or 2 centimeters the gap and sew these together and continue sewing in a straight line. I'm going to leave this for a moment because it's easier to get out of my way like this. And it may take a few tries or a few takes to get this right so that you don't leave too much room, or if you haven't quite precisely continued from the same spot or something like that. But just take it apart and do it again. Luckily it's a short seam, so it's not too much work. You want to see where the seams go and make the fabrics face together. Put the rest of the zipper out of the way. Okay, so I marked the line that I'm going to follow, and I pinned these fabrics together so that they are both going in the same direction. And remember to leave a bit of space between your zipper. Not much, just a centimeter or 2, and then back up in the beginning and then here at the end. And if you've done all your measurements right, you will have the same length on both pieces. When you've sewn on your zipper, you're gonna cut away all this excess fabric and what's left of your zipper and go over them with an overlocker or with zigzag to prevent fraying. The next thing I'm gonna do is optional, but I am going to make a second stitch to the waist seam and sew the seam allowance upward. That way I'm gonna fortify this seam and make sure that the spare fabric in the back stays flat so that it doesn't bulge. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna sew it very close to the original seam. And with your hand, make sure that the seam allowance is facing upwards. And I'm going to again back up over the tunnels to make sure that the tunnel is strong and the bone won't peek through. And my next step is also optional, but I'm going to sew this decorative ribbon to the waist seam to cover all the security seams that I have made, because I'm not going to make a lining for this dress. I want to really make sure that the seams that have most stress are durable, so I'm going to sew this on. And if you are sewing some sort of decorations, depending on how thick your fabric is and how many folds of fabric you have, you may have to sew them on by hand, but I'm gonna try and use my machine. I can't sew the end with the machine, so I'll just start going and sew the ends by hand. After you're done with your waist seam, whether you decorate it or not, the next step is to make the armholes pretty. So I'm going to fold it all the way around for the same amount, and I'm gonna do it to the both armholes, and after that we are going to look into the bones. But first let's do the armholes. I'm gonna start with the one that has the zipper, and I'll probably have to hand sew the very end again. Yep, I'm gonna have to hand sew that, but I'm gonna start from right next to it, and remember to back up. And this is a bit tricky, you have to keep moving and putting the threads out of the way and stuff like that, but do this as neatly as you can. Depending on how thick your fabric is, you might also have to sew the top by hand, but I'm gonna try and go over it with my machine. And I'm gonna do a small backup because again this seam will have a lot of stress on it. I sewed a bit too much on the same direction, so I ended up sewing over the strap, so I'll have to take it back a little. This is a bit difficult because you have this much fabric to deal with, but you can, again, if you want, you can do this whole seam by hand. But when it comes to sewing by hand, I am very lazy. Okay, and then we can continue. So this is what it looks like from the inside and from the outside. And you want to repeat this to the second armhole. I'm going to finish these up later. So this is what the arm looks from the outside, and here is the inside. After you've sewn everything else, now we are going to put the bones in. So you want to take your bone, slide it in, and remember that we are still going to fold this, so I'm gonna need bones that are that long. And I'm gonna cut it so that now when it will go inside the bone tunnel, I have enough fabric left so that I can fold it and sew it, and I won't sew on top of the bone. So you'll get these and put them in place, and we're going to start sewing. Okay, so you want to start from the back. This is my shirring piece, and I'm going to sew a bit on top of it to make sure that the seam holds. So I'll sew and back up, and then I'll keep going and fold the shoulder as I go. And make sure that the bone is tightly over here, and fold it, fold the tunnel. And again you want to back up a couple times to really make sure that the bones will stay in and not poke out. Again, push the bone to the very bottom. Fold your fabric and sew. And again, you want to fold this extra bit under your shoulder strap and sew on top of it to really keep it there. And then we are almost done. I tried the dress on again just to make sure, and it is a good size. So while you're trying on your dress, you want to see if your skirt is the exact length that you want, or do you want to make it shorter perhaps? But mine is good, so I'm just going to fold it. If you want, you can first sew it and then make another round and add the lace like I did with my waist seam, but for this time I'm going to add the lace as I'm going on. And when you're getting close to the end, you want to sew the lace a bit over the first lace, and you also want to make a fold so that it's really not noticeable where the lace ends. So you want to cut it and fold it and sew over. And I'm gonna sew over on top of the lace as well. Because my lace is quite big. And there you have your lace. It's not as perfect as it could be, but that's good enough, so I'm not gonna take that apart. I also ended up sewing the second row of lace, and it would look better if the thicker lace was on the bottom, but because this has two even sides and this only has one, I wanted to make this to the bottom. But it would look prettier if this lace was wider than any extra decoration lace, but these were the only black cotton laces that I had, and because wool is this soft and natural material, I didn't want any so-called plastic laces with them. So this is my hem decoration, and I used the same... I have thread. I used the same method to sew this on than with this one. I first sewed the other side and then the other, and I folded it a bit and sewed across as well because this lace is so wide. But after you've sewn on all your decorations, your dress is done. And here is again some close-up of the back. These parts are shirred, this waist part is not. Here is the zipper, and my bottom laces. Here is the shirring part from the inside, and in here are my bones and the waist seam and the folds. And if you want the folds to be stronger, you can iron them, but I didn't because I like this soft falling motion of my wool. But if you want to make them sharper, you can iron them. Side note, I know this is a very long video and I apologize, but you have always commented on how well I explain things and how detailed I show these. So I had around 7 hours of footage. The total making of this after the pattern was made was maybe 10 or 12 hours, around that. And I have to, of course, edit it down, so I got it, I think it's gonna be a bit under 2 hours after all this blah 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 is in. So I'm sorry that it is long, but I didn't want to leave anything out, and I had to speed up a lot of things, but I still wanted to show how I made them. So again, sorry it's long, but I hope that this is informative enough so that you can make your own dress. And if you have any suggestions on how to film, or if something was unclear, please tell me so that I can make future tutorials better. And I know that there are a few bits when it's a bit dark and one bit where the camera was a bit off because I knocked it off, so I know that those exist and I'm sorry, but if you have anything else, please don't hesitate to tell me, and enjoy this tutorial. And this is again what the dress looks like when it's worn. And again, if you have any questions that I can help you with, please ask me, I will answer. And I will be making different I have at least 5 different types of skirts that I'm going to do. For some I have fabrics for, and I will do JSKs with an actual bust. And I'll show how to lollify blouses and cardigans and stuff like that. And of course, other ranty videos will be coming at some point when I have the time and so on. And thank you again for watching. I know this was very long. And please tell me if you have any comments, requests or stuff like that. And I will see you again next Wednesday. Bye!